Give a man a fish and you feed him for a day. Teach a man to fish and you lose a perfect business opportunity. Since young, we have been convinced that during the 21st century, there has been a universal pursuit towards global development and egalitarian economies and societies. The idea of a utopian world with no famine, no poverty, and ubiquitous well-being sounds fantastic, right? However, when we sit back and examine how much countries are truly operating together in order to achieve this, the reality is much more disappointing. To what extent is globalization global? Why are some countries flooded with money and others don't have enough to put their citizens in schools? To answer this question, we have to trace our steps all the way back to the 18th century when imperialism took the world by storm.
Imperialism is the practice of acquiring and maintaining control over colonies and dependencies. The old imperial model, better known as the classical imperial model, refers to the period of Europe colonialism in the late 19th and early 20th century. European powers such as France, Great Britain, and Spain established colonies around the world, primarily in Africa, Asia, and South America, for economic and strategic reasons.
The dependency theory, first introduced in the late 1950s by Rolf Prebisch, is a form of neo-imperialism. Its theory suggests that developed countries continue to exploit developing countries through more discrete means, such as economic relationships. It is not to be confused with classical imperialism, as it differs from it in several ways. Firstly, classical imperialism was motivated by the desire of territorial expansion. Markets and resources, where neo-imperialism was fueled by the desire of economic and political control, whilst asserting dominance through the means of soft power. To add on, their political legitimacy and their form of supremacy also differs. Classical imperialism was often justified through the theory of supremacism, and it involved direct colonization of foreign territories. While neo-imperialism relies on the rhetoric of free trade, the promotion of human rights and democracy, plus their approach is more confidential as it's a form of domination, contains ideas like cultural influence, political intervention, and of course, economic dependency.
And so, developed countries continue to maintain control over the economies of developing countries, making them dependent on them for trade and investment, basically holding their economies hostage. This generates numerous problems and negative consequences for the third world countries. Now, there wouldn't be enough storage on this camera to film a documentary where we discuss all the countries that can temporarily suffer from the dependency theory. Therefore, let's talk about a specific one that experts just can't seem to figure out how to make it completely flourish. In this documentary, we will be talking about the beautiful nation of Thailand, a country that no matter how much they grow economically, they just can't seem to fully develop.
In recent years, Thailand has seen significant growth in their economy with an average annual GDP growth rate of around 3 to 4%. The country has started to become a major player in the global economy by implementing multiple neoliberal economic policies such as liberalizing trade and investment. Classical liberal thinkers like Immanuel Kant would argue that Thailand's development is and should mainly be driven by its want of individual freedoms and open trade. This perspective would most definitely highlight Thailand's efforts towards democratic reforms and its incorporation into the global economy as crucial for its development, as well as promoting foreign direct investment. Not to mention, they have a wide focus on exports, which accounts for 70% of their GDP in areas such as agriculture, manufacturing, and tourism. Their economy has also become more diverse with the growth of service sectors like finance and healthcare. They've also seen active participation in implementing various policies to support economic development, including investments in education and infrastructure. Now, although it may seem that Thailand is growing exponentially, it seems to have encountered a developmental barrier, and there are multiple reasons for that.
We can start with their demographic challenges. Not only is Thailand suffering from an aging population, it's also facing a population decline overall, affecting its production and development. Secondly, we see a massive income distribution inequality, in other words, a lack of equity. In Thailand, with a wage gap that will increase by 10.94% annually according to the Gini coefficient verified by the World Bank. We also see difficulties with Thailand's infrastructure as they have many funding restraints, corruption, environmental regulation, land acquisition issues, and political instability.
Thailand has entered multiple trade agreements that have created unhealthy dependencies on particular markets and partners, what some would call putting all their eggs in one basket. It is leaving it very vulnerable to shocks in the global demand, such as the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which is already scaring away Thailand's investors. Thailand is considered peripheral in the conditions of the dependency theory, which argues that the country is economically dependent on developed countries, creating an unbalanced relationship which is ultimately holding them back from developing. Multinational corporations also have been accused of extracting resources and wealth without contributing to their development, and in the means of not paying adequate taxes, finding and exploiting loopholes in Thai law, and not adequately treating environmental and social issues such as land degradation appropriately.
Now that we have a general idea of the specific problem Thailand faces, let's dive into a political analysis of why these problems exist in the first place and why they are so destructive to an infant economy like Thailand's.
Even though, as we mentioned earlier, that Thailand has been making some remarkable developmental progress, there's still deeply rooted issues within the country that don't allow it to reach its maximum potential. When conflicts are deeply entrenched in the structure of countries, it is not only difficult to identify them, but it is even harder to fix them as it entails grand political reform. This problem is otherwise known as the poverty cycle or developmental trap. The poverty cycle explains how there are deeply embedded self-reinforcing mechanisms in underdeveloped countries that create an inability to properly progress and require outside intervention in order to be stopped.
An example of an issue that obstructs the path for full development in Thailand is its overly low fertility rates, which are creating prominent socioeconomic problems. According to the National Library of Medicine, a healthy developed nation requires 2.1 children per mother. Thailand remains consistently at 1.5. This creates a massive shortage of labor force in the country and high government expenditure on elderly benefits. It is not a coincidence that parents are having too little children, but a choice that stems from a systematic issue. What we want is free education in order to reduce our costs of raising children. It is very difficult for a young couple to look after their babies when they have to work for a living. The government has a universal healthcare scheme, but parents have to wait in line, and if they opt for private hospitals, the charges are much higher than most can afford. These are some of the claims Orapak makes, a Thai mother of two who speaks for the majority of the parents in the country.
Another facet in which Thailand is suffering systematically is in its particular vulnerability to climate change, air pollution, and environmental degradation. Thailand is a country that for centuries has been prohibited from developing through political unrest and exploitation in the form of neo-imperialism from already developed countries. With their newly found democracy and economic growth, the country has already started to experience problems with air pollution, declining wildlife populations, deforestation, soil erosion, water scarcity, and waste issues. The idea of solving developmental shortcomings by mimicking the industrialization process the West underwent during the 18th century, otherwise known as the modernization theory proposed by Samuel P. Huntington, fails to consider the environmental implications which are particularly relevant in such a naturally rich nation. From an economic perspective in 2004, the cost of air and water pollution for the country scales up to approximately 1.6 to 2.6 of GDP per year, and numerous reports indicate a loss of tourism due to lower biodiversity and environmental welfare. From a social perspective, experts indicate that Thailand is particularly susceptible to malnourishment, erosion, and water scarcity induced by climate change crisis in the near future. Some of the last things Thailand needs. This poses the question of to what extent is Thailand able to escape the poverty cycle and flourish through industrialization, given that this process intrinsically comes at an environmental sacrifice which is a key element of Thailand.
Lastly, another key developmental point to address in Thailand that perpetuates the poverty cycle is corruption. The most renowned measurement of corruption is Transparency International's Corruption Perceptions Index, or CPI, which calculates corruption based on their perceived levels of public sector corruption determined by expert assessments and opinion surveys, and it defines it as abuse of entrusted power for private gain. Out of 180 countries, Thailand ranks at a shockingly high 110th place. Even though Thailand has a specific institution designed to fight corruption, it is still an endemic part of its governance, given its weak legal framework from frequent military dictatorships and political instability. Professor Songdis Peryangsan calculates that corruption will rob Thai society of between $50 to $100 billion yearly.
Birth rates, environmental degradation, and corruption are just a few examples that are indicative of Thailand's social and political systemic flaws. These flaws perpetuate what we know as the poverty cycle and impede development processes to occur. Critical theory suggests that they exist due to a long history of classical and neo-imperialism that has subjected Thailand to significant retardation in development and continues to disallow the nation to further progress through economic dependence and external political influence. As long as these issues that are so deeply entrenched in Thailand's socioeconomic structure are not fixed, according to the idea of the poverty cycle, economic growth won't happen, and if it does, it will be nullified in the long run. So now that we know exactly what is wrong with Thailand, let's take a look at what exactly it has been doing that is allowing them to flourish and what it can do in order to break this trap and continue progressing.
When discussing what possible solutions Thailand can take in order to escape the poverty cycle, it fundamentally comes down to a question of what are the most important developmental factors. Our global politics class came up with a list of the most important factors, and out of wide variety, we included the most prevalent, were strong governance, appropriate economic practices, and social empowerment. Given we all agreed these were the strongest, let us take a look at how Thailand can grow in these departments. The good thing about Thailand is that it's not a country that is starting from scratch. Following Maslow's hierarchy of needs, we can see that Thailand, relative to other underdeveloped Asian countries, can confidently say most citizens can meet their psychological and safety needs. Also, with reference to Rostow's 5 stages of development, Thailand can arguably be on the 3rd stage of the so-called takeoff, after the 2nd stage of the preconditions for takeoff, and before the 4th one of drive to maturity. So, what does a country like Thailand do when they are taking off? Is that still have deeply rooted conflicts that seem to not let them go any further.
To promote the robust economic integrity developmental factor, let's study a country with a very similar geopolitical situation that has been in an alike situation as Thailand is right now. Let's take a look at what the nation of China did in order to become the economic superpower we know today. Similar to what Thailand is beginning to do now, economic diversification was the key for China's development. European countries, namely the United Kingdom, were deliberately keeping China as a weak economy in order to exploit its rich resource pools. It is important to understand that in an economy there are 3 sectors. The primary sector, which relates to the harvesting of natural resources, for instance agriculture, fishing, and mining. Then there's the secondary sector, which is where you get the natural resources collected from the first sector and then manufacture goods from them. And lastly, the tertiary sector, which rather than producing goods, you provide services. Think about the primary sector as being the ingredients for a cookie, the secondary sector being the chef making the cookies, and the third is selling the cookies in a stand. Remember what we said at the beginning? Teach a man to fish and that ruins a perfectly good business opportunity? That is what high-income developed countries were doing with China. They wanted to maintain their economy in the primary agrarian sector, export the natural resources harvested for overly cheap prices back to Europe, produce products from the resources in Europe, and then sell back the finalized manufactured goods back to China for overly high prices. Once China broke this abusive economic structure and released itself from their import reliance, clearly representative of neo-imperialism, the country experienced an unprecedented economic boom that makes it the 2nd richest country in the world today in terms of GDP. Now, imagine I am the country of Yan and I have 5 euros in total. I just gathered this piece of rubber, which Thailand is very rich in by the way, and it cost me 1 euro to collect. Now I have 2 options. The most common option in Asian countries due to the lack of industrial infrastructure is to sell this piece of rubber to a high-income producing nation for 2 euros. Then they produce, let's say, a wheel in Europe, and I buy back that wheel as an import for 5 euros, leaving me at the end of the day with 1 euro and a wheel in total. What would be the most profitable for me to do is, again, gather the rubber for 1 euro, then rather than send it off, build factories and industrial machinery and foster entrepreneurship that would allow me to produce the wheel in my own country for another euro, Then I can make 3 wheels for €2, keep 1 wheel, export the other 2 for €4, leaving me with €6 and a tire in total. That, ladies and gentlemen, is what is called economic diversification and transition into the secondary sector, which is how most Asian tigers we know today have gotten to where they are with their vast resource pools. This can enrich the government, which will then lead to larger interventionary government policies, such as increasing in healthcare, education, and infrastructure expenditures. All these things that in the long term can help increase birth rates, raise climate change awareness and remediation, fix corruption, and more.
Another way Thailand can develop is by further integrating itself into the globalization and economic interconnectedness transition that the world has been taking since the start of the 21st century. In a political sphere dominated by intergovernmental organizations, free trade, and open borders, by entering these practices and collaborating with more states and IGOs, Thailand can surely expect economic, technological, and social growth. This comes directly from a neoliberal view on globalization, which explains that national allegiances and arbitrary state borders increase productivity, competition, and market range, and create more dynamic and vigorous societies.
And now, to sum it all up, although Thailand has recently made meaningful strides on a path to development, the reality is dwarfed by its potential level of development. Thailand suffers from 3 structural aspects that impair their ability to develop further. Firstly, augmentous causes of raising a child causes the birth rate in Thailand to remain at a suboptimal level for development. As Thailand lacks free education, the cost of having and raising a child is exponentially greater. A large part of Thailand's population works for a living, making them unable to look after their children if they can't afford to put them through school. And for parents to work, they must admit their children to childcare, which is an additional cost. If Thailand was to implement a policy providing free education for all citizens, it would greatly increase its opportunity to develop through increased child birth rates. Increasing child birth rates will lead to a younger population on average and thus a greater labor force. Additionally, Thailand's population getting younger on average would also decrease the government's focus on elderly benefits and thus be able to invest much more in the future. Thailand is not the second most visited country in Asia by tourists for no reason. In addition to its stunning nature, it is very biodiverse. The modernization theory, or following the steps of the West to develop, would only have an adverse effect on Thailand's prosperity, with reports already having displayed a decrease in tourism as a result of biodiversity loss and damage to the environment. Additionally, Thailand is more susceptible than other countries to damage that come as a result of climate change, making it even less sensible for them to follow the path that the West paved.
The importance of proper governance for the development of a country could not be stressed enough, and that can definitely be seen in the case of Thailand. Thailand ranks in the bottom 40% of the Corruption Perceptions Index, and indicating an extensive level of government officials prioritizing personal gain over serving the country's needs. Corruption in Thailand extends past the government, with transnational corporations abusing the lackluster regulations to avoid fees and circumvent their responsibility to the Thai people. But it's not all bad for Thailand. As we've mentioned prior, Thailand has great prospects for development. But what could be done for Thailand to finally prosper to the utmost of their abilities? We've mentioned Thailand's inability to follow the modernization theory to develop. However, what if they followed the steps of development of a country more like themselves? Like, for example, China. More specifically, diversifying their economy. Specifically in terms of production sectors. They can make better use of their extensive rubber reserves if they just used it for production of final goods and exported them instead of the rubber. Additionally, Thailand could greatly benefit from further integrating into the global economy and collaborating with more states and non-state actors. The outlook for Thailand is generally positive. It has substantial potential to develop, and it is on a positive path to success. If Thailand is able to overcome these structurally entrenched inhibitors of development, they would finally be able to make use of their potential. In addition to the growth Thailand would yield from overcoming these struggles, it would also make a more lucrative opportunity for investors to make use of Thailand's great prospects. Maybe after all, if you teach a man to fish, you'll actually get a new and solid business partner.